Amen. Well, friends, we've officially made it. We've entered the season of Lent. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent. Lent, a 40-day march into and through, as the Gospel of Matthew says, the wilderness. 40 days, wandering in the desert 40 years, the Hebrews. Going into the desert for 40 days to face temptation, Christ. And now Lent leads us into a 40-day recollection of what it is all about. 40 days to acknowledge the struggles and the temptations that we face in our lives. An opportunity, and I emphasize that it is an opportunity if you take advantage of it, to engage and to reflect not merely on the life and the ministry of Jesus, but on his crucifixion and his death as well. And for many Christians in various traditions, this is practiced in all kinds of different ways. Deeper reflections, meditations, as well as acts of contritions. I know there are people here who come from all different kinds of church and religious backgrounds, and Lent is practiced and lived out in those situations differently. When I was a child, they used to hand out to us in the Sunday school a 30 pieces of silver offering folder. Anybody else get one of those? None of you are German Congregationalists, I guess. They did that. We got this little folder. We were so proud of it. And inside of it, if you were a little child, you put in like 30 dimes. And if you were an older person, you put in like 30 quarters. And if you were really somebody, maybe 30, 50-cent pieces or something like that. But the idea was that you would say a prayer, you'd have a family devotional, and then you would put in an offering that went to mission that, 30 pieces of silver was the price of betrayal that Judas gave for Jesus. That was the whole theme. And so that was the practice of Lent in church school, and I still remember it. Other people, growing up in different traditions, may have the practice of giving something up for Lent. Anybody else have that? Anybody grow up with you're supposed to give something up for Lent? Well, let me see, raise your hands. I hear mumbling, but yeah, you're supposed to give something up for Lent. The problem with that is when I talk to people, they're willing to give something up for Lent, but what they want to give up really is often not a sacrifice, but it's a luxury. Oh, for 40 days I will not have my vanilla latte at Starbucks. Or for 40 days I'm really going to exercise and lose 5 pounds. Or I'm going to cut back on desserts. You see, but the issue there is it's not just giving something up, it's giving something up for what? Just ourselves? In my previous church, we asked people to give something up. If you're going to give up a vanilla latte, let's ask what it's about. And we said, if you're going to give that up and you're spending $5 a day, take the $5, set it aside, and at the end, give it to our missions. Make it count for something. Because the reality is, you should be cutting back on desserts, and you should be exercising, and maybe you shouldn't be drinking that latte every day anyway. So what kind of a sacrifice, really, is that? You see, what's been lost, and I think we need to remember, is that Lent was the big season of the early church. Lent was the big season of the early church. The Gospels telling about Jesus' life weren't written for 40 years after Jesus' death. They weren't worried about that. They didn't talk about that. Paul's letters and the epistles of the New Testament simply talked about what he did for us. It's about Lent. It's about his death and his resurrection. That's what they were immediately concerned about. And so Lent became the big season. Easter became the big day, not Christmas. Not Christmas. You see, the cross became the symbol of Christianity, not the Christmas tree. Well, we like the Christmas tree because that's a lot more fun, right? And we get things there. But the cross symbolizes something different, and the cross requires us to give something, not merely to focus on what we get. These notions and what Lent stands for, the cross, the death of Christ, the act of God being present in Christ, and that God would humanly endure what it's like, to be human, even to the point of knowing death, was shocking in the ancient world. It would knock people back on their heels. That's just not how they saw the gods working among them. Oh, they believed in lots of gods, and they believed that those gods lived and walked among them, that the gods interacted with them, that the gods toyed with them, that the gods had sexual relations with them. But to say that any of those gods would give up the power and the glory to die for humans, that was unheard of. But this was the message that the early church and the Christians offered. And Lent was the practice of remembering it and mirroring it, at least in a small way, through sacrificial living of themselves. But what has happened, I think, is that, somehow I think this notion of sacrifice has been overlooked. We considered antiquated, too gory, ignored. After all, calling people to sacrifice is never easy, and I got to tell you, calling people to sacrifice these days is exceptionally hard. That is just not the mood that is out there. And so even if there is an attempt to know about sacrificial living, it often becomes that vanilla latte Lenten light. I mean, giving up one's life on a cross and giving up one's favorite dessert, really? Isn't it about more than that? Rather, it's about what does my faith mean and how much do I value it? That's really what we're asked to consider for 40 days. What does my faith mean? How do I live it out? What's the value I place upon it? And does the value and the meaning I give to it really represent a sacrifice worthy of what I profess? Traveling through Turkey this last week, visiting sites of the early church, Paul and the disciples, I was very vividly reminded of the price early believers paid for their beliefs. Ostracized from their families, pushed out in constant fear of being persecuted. Paul writes from living in prison. We visited Cappadocia, where the Christians lived literally underground like ants, hundreds of feet underground in tunnels and in caves, because attacks could come at any time. This was a huge price that was attached to their faith, but it was something they said had value. Their faith had value. It had place. It wasn't about what they believed. It was about who they were and how they lived. And in that regard, this notion of believing wasn't considered a sacrifice. It was a lifestyle. It was a witness. A witness, which is interesting. The word witness is having a revival in the mainline Protestant churches. We are talking about being witnesses. And you know what the word witness really means? It means martyr. A witness is one who is willing to die for their beliefs. And so Paul, when Paul is writing this letter to the persecuted Christians in Rome, he says that when Christ dwells within you, it's not a matter of what's easy or quick or convenient. The Spirit is about what's deep and what's powerful and what's eventually life-altering, that carries you to the end when other people will fall short. And the season of Lent is God saying, this is what you mean to me. What do I mean to you? It was that great theologian Karl Barth who once said, in effect, and I like this, he said, Christians fuss and argue too much about whether or not they're getting it right, when the question is, are you getting it lived? Are you getting it lived? It's odd that, this is Stewardship Sunday for us in this church. After all, most churches do it in the fall, historically tied to the harvest, bringing in the sheaves, all that good stuff. But really, maybe it's more appropriate to do it at this time of the year. Because tied to Lent tied to Lent, and Lent is tied to sacrifice. And what is stewardship except looking at who we are, what we have, what we're about? What is stewardship except that? And in this regard, two stories come to mind. The first involving a young boy going to church school a number of years ago, and his parents really didn't have any involvement in the church, but they thought it was important for the child to go. So they sent him to the church, which was a few blocks away, and they gave him $1 for his offering, and the little boy took it, and he went, and on his way walking to church, he went by an ice cream store, and of course ice cream stores have all that great stuff sitting there in the window. He looked at the dollar, he looked at the ice cream, he walked in, and he bought himself a big cone. And then he went to Sunday school. And upon his return, the parents do what all good parents do. They sat down and quizzed him. How was it? What did they teach you? What it was all about? And the boy responded just fine until they said, "What did you do with your offering?" Well, the boy squirmed and said, "Well, I bought an ice cream cone." "What do you mean you bought an ice cream cone?" "Well, it's really okay, Dad. I bought an ice cream cone. I gave the dollar to the ice cream man so that he could give it to God." We live in an age, hear me now, we live in an age, and with the passing of a generation that took the church and the institution seriously, we cannot give it to somebody else and assume they will give it to God. It is ours to do or not to do. And in an age where the church is struggling and dying, this is serious stuff. So contrast that story with the story of a young man considering at one point in his life what he's going to do with his life, and he is in church and he is worshiping, and as the offering plate comes around, he doesn't put anything in the offering plate. He lays the offering plate on the floor and steps and started all the missions and let go of what he had in terms of a very good life to make a difference in that country. We are called to do such a thing. That our stewardship is, we label it in this way or that way, but our stewardship is really about not getting it right, but getting it lived. Learning what sacrificial living means, that in the giving is the living, and in the living we are receiving, giving from God we never imagined before. Every week when you enter this sanctuary, if you do, I hope you do, there are several visual reminders of what I am trying to say. Because as you enter this sanctuary, if you come in through the back door, you will see this window right here. This is the first thing you see when you come in this church. It is a scallop shell with 3 drops. It is a symbol of your baptism. It is the symbol of entering into the covenant community. And as you turn right to take a seat, the next thing you focus on as a part of this community is the altar and the cross. The symbols of what it means to be a part of the Christian community. Not just this church, but the whole Christian community. It is a symbol of sacrifice. It is a symbol of offering of ourselves. Every time you come in here, it's built into the architecture. Exactly what I am talking about. But I like one more symbol that got changed when they remodeled this church. And I love how it looks, but they changed something. They moved the cross from the center over here, this big one. See this big cross? You probably don't even notice it that much. But every Sunday when I stand up here, every time I turn this way, I see that cross. And I like that cross because that cross is bigger than any of us. It's bigger than any one of us. And yet, what I tell you is that cross is there for all of us. That's powerful stuff. It's bigger than any of us. It's bigger than anybody who'd ever come into this sanctuary. But it is also there for anyone who would enter as well. Over the past few weeks, our stewardship committee has worked very hard to present some fun and hopefully enlightening videos. Did you see me last week on the roof? They got me down. Wasn't that nice? Some fun and hopefully enlightening videos regarding the positive outcomes of giving to the church. And with that, the specific needs we have to continue. And you know, they've packaged it in a very palatable way. But the core message of giving is far more incisive and a bit more demanding and perhaps painful. Because it calls us not just to sacrificial giving, it calls us to sacrificial living. And not just for 40 days, though that's a good start, but it calls us to think about how we offer our time, our skills, our talents, to reflect upon really what are we offering to God, and is it faithful in regard to what we believe God offers us. In one of my churches, a young family taught me an example of stewardship. They said that they determined their pledge. They had 3 kids, so they pledged so much for each person, mom, dad, and the 3 kids. And then they pledged for a 4th kid that wasn't theirs. That's how they did it. They pledged for a 4th kid who wasn't theirs. You know, we can say 10%. Nobody pays attention to that. And then they always ask, well, 10% net, 10, you know, don't get into that. You just examine your heart and what Christ's ministry means to you, and you give accordingly. Because once upon a time, and I say this sincerely, once upon a time, the sacrifices of our Christian ancestors, those people believed that their sacrifices had the power to change the world. Because they believed, their passionate purpose, they believed, was to save the world. Not someone else. It wasn't someone else that was going to do it for them, but they themselves. Well, I don't know, but when I look around, I think the world is still in need of some saving. And maybe we should be passionate about doing it again. Because Lent reminds us that we as Christians are not about giving up. Whew, it's too much, I give up. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to give it up. To give it up for God, because the cross reminds us of what God has already given to you. We don't sing it much anymore, but I don't know why. I was thinking of the hymnal, and many, especially in an older generation, just remember the song, and I'm going to close with it because it's, I don't know, sometimes the Spirit just calls you to do it. It's 207. Just as I am without one plea, but that your blood was shed for me, and that you called inviting me. Oh, amen. And at this time we continue